Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prize of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to subscribe to Locals to get updates on the channel and to support the channel for those who are already supporting. Thank you for your support. It's necessary to keep this channel going. So, Logos and I, we are going to do our fourth conversation on questions about Christianity. And this got started when I was talking to Logos about Jeremiah 7:31. So we read here, and they built the high places of Tophet, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my heart. That's also translated as come into my mind in other versions. And so this got me thinking there's a certain solution to the problem of the forms that says that the forms exist in the mind of God. But we read here that things that are intrinsically evil don't exist in God's mind. In fact, they weren't there in the first place. So then, how is it that the forms can exist, forms of that nature, for that matter, can exist in the mind of God? Now, I guess one could say that's hyperbole, but I don't see any reason to think so because when God says, I did not command it, that's not going to be read as hyperbolic. That's going to be read straight up. And I don't see there's any shift in the verse to indicate otherwise. And thinking about this, I was saying that, well, okay, we can talk about universals as just sort of what we might call artifacts, just things like horses, chairs, rivers, trees, animals, humans, which they just are, right? There's not necessarily a moral quality ascribed to them. So those could exist in the mind of God. We could say forms of actions that are either morally required or adiaphora could exist in the mind of God. But I do think, though, that at least those actions that are immoral and sinful and those relationships that don't exist, can't exist in the mind of God, because in some sense he says that they don't. So then where do they exist? So one possibility I floated was we have a kind of moderate conceptualism where in the minds of demons and uh, fallen humans these things exist, but they exist only in their minds. And yeah, so why don't we just start with that touch point?
Yeah, I mean that sounds like a good intro to where the conversation got started with us. Yeah, and I think the interesting issue that came up with respect to the forms and these things is um, what sustains the mental energy of things that aren't God. And I think the broader context of this discussion actually was like a creation ex nihilo, and the idea that everything that exists apart from God is just kind of like willed from God's intellect in some way. God didn't fashion it out of other materials or anything like that. He just kind of like wills it in his mind that it is so, and so it is so. And so if you have, let's say, demons thinking evil thoughts, it's only because God has in his mind's eye demons thinking evil thoughts. Or we could make a slightly more moderate claim where God is kind of like causally willing a mental space, kind of like a power source, from which demons can then draw on to then think their own evil thoughts. And so where the conversation gets interesting is we can argue about to what degree God's mental activity directly gives you the building blocks for these thoughts. It seems like if God sustains everything through his mental activity in some sense, it doesn't seem like there's any getting around them.
Right. Well, okay. So the first thing is they okay. So there's I think two separate questions here. One, do they still exist in God's mind on the one hand, and then two, to what extent, even if we take what I would call this moderate conceptualism view, to what extent is God conceiving the forms of these entities in his own mind that are conceiving these sinful associations and concepts, in some sense impugning God. So I think what we could say is we could imagine a situation in which someone or something is directly responsible for the existence of someone else, but in a way that isn't necessarily mental or conceptual, or is mental and conceptual in the limited sense, such that they don't know what the other person is thinking. So, I mean, obviously, for example, a husband and a wife are responsible for a child, but they don't necessarily know what that child is thinking. Now, that child isn't, of course, sustained every moment by his parents, not in the way that God, according to Christian theology, sustains the universe. So it's not an exact analogy, but we see that there. So I guess we'll start with that first bit. What do you say to that first bit about just the where the form and these concepts exist?
Yeah, so the important question is the bit at the end about like the parents begetting a child. Um, so if one wanted to make a metaphor where God was like, I don't know, Sisyphus or something, and there was like all this material that constitutes the universe, say physical and mental being, and God is like Sisyphus just kind of like holding it on his shoulders, and then whatever happens in that landscape then happens, God is merely the foundation keeping it afloat. Um, that would be, I think, analogous to the parent-child thing. Well, not completely, but relevantly so, I think, in the sense that I've given you the building block for your existence, and then you're kind of going off on your own. I don't have the power to sustain anything more directly than that, so you're kind of making it up as you go along. Um, but that metaphor kind of requires some kind of like ex materia cause in the sense that parents build their children ex materia, or there is some material to the universe that God kind of stitches together and keeps together, but the material otherwise kind of functions and chugs along doing what it does. There's kind of like a some degree of material separation from God's mental activity and the material the universe is constitutive of that kind of like chugs along. Where the analogy kind of gets rocky is if like uh your child is sustained by your direct mental activity moment to moment, and or your child's ability to think thoughts and what kind of thoughts is sustained by your mental activity moment to moment, because then it becomes unclear, right? If parents just build their children ex materia out of biological parts, whatever extra stuff in there like mental quality and things like that that aren't necessarily materia are kind of out of your jurisdiction. You just provide the raw material building blocks of conception, and then whatever else happens in the dualistic model. But if everything is fundamentally mental from the perspective of the parents, and everything the child does is just kind of like an artifact of your mentally sustaining the being of the child, the degree of separation kind of shatters.
Right. So I think there's something I want to make clear first. Are you okay? So when you talk about creation ex nihilo, are you assuming in that definition that the physical created order is a product of God's mind?
Well, this goes back to a previous conversation we had. It's kind of unclear. So creation ex materia would be super clear. So let's say there's some prime matter, some material, and let's say the material doesn't impart its own laws or causality, but God kind of like imparts the laws and causality of the material, and then just kind of watches it go from there. And then whatever happens via the causal laws of matter, just kind of like goes. It could be a deistic hypothesis or even a quasi-Thomistic one. um, so that kind of makes sense. The material's there. There's a separation between God and matter, and you can kind of distinguish the immaterial law-like behavior in matter caused by God from all of the intermediate causes that are just like things that happen as a result of that God doesn't directly cause. But if we're talking about creation ex nihilo, um, you know, I mean, even creation ex deo is like, creation out of God, which is some kind of like pantheist or panentheist or some kind of hypothesis like that. That's also kind of clear. Ex nihilo is a little less clear because God doesn't seem to build stuff out of anything, including himself. He just kind of like wills it. And so, with anything you talk about, chairs or desks or me or you, it's not like there's this material substrate that ultimately makes us. The buck doesn't stop there. Whatever our material building blocks are, however they're constituted, are things that are kind of like willed into existence moment to moment by God, I guess, is the best way I've been able to make sense of it.
Okay, so yeah, because what I would want to say is that the material that is out there, independent of God, that forms the universe, at its original point of creation, we could say that that was an act of the will. But what I would say though is that's a different question from the continued sustaining of that creation. What I would want to say is that it's a lot more like the nature of God's essence. So not so much as his mind, but his ontology of essence sustains the universe uh, um, in a way that is somewhat analogous, but not completely analogous to the way that a heartbeat sustains a human being. It's not something that you have to think about moment to moment to keep alive. Your heart will just do that for you and keep you alive. Now, no, of course, at some point, God could decide to not do that, and then the whole space time would collapse. But I would want to argue, though, and I think most Christians would want to argue that it's not like Bishop Barclay, where the universe has to be perceived by the intellect of God every single instance for it to be to exist, which is his sort of explanation for how God sustains the universe. But maybe we could view it as more of like a conditional heartbeat kind of support, where it's from the God has this sort of, we already gave the example that, with Christianity and being filled with the Holy Spirit, that, right, so when the Holy Spirit fills a Christian, it's not so much that he becomes God, but that God is in some sense in him. And so we also know that God is omnipresent. So in some sense, that omnipresence could be construed as infusing some sort of sustenance into the system, which wouldn't necessarily be an act of the will.
Okay. Yeah, this is a little bit different, I think, than the last time we talked about this. So let me process this for a second. Um, what I think about that is, I guess this question is going to be. This is actually really relevant because I'm about to talk with Josh Rasmussen about this later this month. I think what the question is going to veer into next is a question of particularity. So I can conceive that God could sustain like being as such autonomously, like a heartbeat or a breathing or something like that. I guess the question depends on the law-like regularities of being, the particular way that being is. And this is actually really, really important, not just for this conversation, but other arguments about God. So let's just take the fine-tuning argument for a second. Um, the fine-tuning argument works to the degree that it does because we have this abductive schema where if some property of the universe holds, let's say it's being life permitting or something else, a good explanation for that holding is that God wants it to hold or intends it to hold. There's some connection between what God intends to be about the universe and the way the universe is. Um, and so while whatever being happens would happen, I think, because of God's autonomous thing, I think the abductive schema falls apart if the intent is gone, the aboutness is gone. So God wants a universe about life, a life permitting universe. And it's the aboutness of the proposition that makes the link between God and the thing. But aboutness is it's a property of mental propositions and mental thoughts. We have thoughts about things, and so God's thought about a life permitting universe is the thing that explains the universe as being life permitting. And so once you start adding the aboutness, the particularity there, I think that's where things get a little more complicated.
Right. Okay. So when we let's sort of break down sort of the act of the will, because that seems to be where this is really focusing on. So we can say that a form of a thing exists in the intellect of some rational agent, but we can also view an act of the will as the deliberate intent to do something. So I think that if we say that, say those again, say sinful activities or sinful associations which don't exist, in God's mind, which would appear that Jeremiah is saying, is that even if he chooses to will some process that maintains the universe, I don't think that's the same thing as those things existing as forms in his intellect. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a standard defense. God wills for free will's sake that it's possible that a thing occurs. But I think what your verse in question is saying is that God didn't God didn't have in mind that somebody, least of all you people, were to act on this possibility in the way that you acted on it. And so, yeah, there's a difference between willing a universe to be about such so that things are possible. So the universe is about free will in some sense, using the terminology I was using earlier, right? God is seeming to intend the universe on this model to be about free will. And so in order to make the universe about free will and free choices and so on, there have to be some evils that are allowed. But it, doesn't necessarily register on God's mind that you should do them, just that you can do them.
Okay, yeah. So maybe this is where some of the confusion is arising. The way I would read that is not that God didn't, either foresee or expect or foresee that Israel was going to do something like that. The way I read it is more like, well, I gave you a set of instructions which were pretty clear, and you thought you knew better, and you did what I didn't want you to do. And so far from me wanting you to do it, it didn't enter into my mind. So you could envision a parent saying to a child after giving some rules before he has to leave the house, say, and then he comes back and the child has done something wrong, and he's like, well, I told you what to do. And the thing that you did, which sort of one of the trends we see in the Bible is this idea of second guessing God. So like Saul says, well, Samuel gave me these pretty clear instructions, but I think God really wants this. And of course, that's not what God wanted, and Samuel judged Saul for that. And I think that's more the context in which that should be seen. Does that in any way change what you're saying?
No, I think that's perfectly compatible with what I just said. Of course, it's going to enter God's mind that the Israelites could do it, but in the same parent-child relationship that you're talking about. Think of it this way: instead of thinking about God building a universe, think about parents leaving something in a drawer. Let's suppose parents have like matches in a drawer in case of emergency, but the drawer doesn't have locks on it or something. Well, they have matches in the drawer because it's possible that in case of emergency, somebody could get the matches out and do something with them. But that doesn't mean that if the parent leaves the house, it enters their mind that the child should get the matches out and burn the house down.
Right, right. So then the question is not does it exist as a form in God's mind, but to what extent is God willing it responsible for it? No, is in what sense God willing the preconditions for something responsible for that thing? Is that where the question is moving?
I think there's two questions that the thing is moving. So the first question is one of ontology. So fundamentally, since God made us out of nothing, it seems to me that fundamentally we are nothing outside of God's willing us to exist. Um, God's aboutness, about us and about the world and everything else. God knew us before we were born and so on. So there's something about it. It seems like if everything is ex nihilo, the buck never stops at whatever the material thing is, because the material thing isn't grounded on anything apart from the will of God, ultimately. Um, and so let's just take some evil action that happens, murder or pick your poison. Fundamentally, it's not like we can say, well, person X with some physical properties uses a physical tool to kill person Y. We tell the physical story and we're kind of done with it. The mystery there is, well, the physical things aren't the end of the story. So person X only exists because God is willing physical X to exist, and the tool that person X is using to kill person Y is willed by God to exist, and so on. This is something that C.S. Lewis kind of touches on, and I think it was Mere Christianity. There was an excerpt I read in a philosophy of religion class where Lewis was talking about um, somebody being able to beat their neighbor with a baseball bat or something. And well, God could just like will the bat to not exist or to turn into like rubber or some soft material in their hand or something else, right? And so one question is the ethical one, right? The problem of evil question. Why does God allow this? But that's not the question I'm interested in. The question I'm interested in is, to what degree is the carrying out of person A beating person A with a bat? To what degree is that being carried out as kind of like an act of a story in God's mind? God's mind, in some sense, is about the story as it takes place. So the ontological question is one question. And piggybacking on the ontological question is the question of free will, in the sense that, well, let's say we appeal to dualism, right? So we've got our physical body, we've got like our immaterial mind and soul. But God didn't make us out of an immaterial mind and soul. Again, ultimately, everything is created ex nihilo. It's not like our mind and soul are fundamental like entities of the universe or anything. Whatever constitutes our mind and soul is something that God just kind of like wills into being ex nihilo, and it's kind of like there at his leisure. So whatever my mind does, let's say I get really mad and I intend to hit my neighbor with a baseball bat. That whole mental process, in some sense, is facilitated ontologically by God's willing it to be. And so those are the two branching questions. Like, what is our will constitutive of if there is no bottom we can appeal to aside from God's willing it so? And the act in question, like an act in a play or an act in a scene, what is the ontology constituting that act?
Right. So the first thing is with the idea of, okay, so the forms themselves being rooted somewhere. That's one thing. Now, to I think I would agree with this intuition that to observe a thing or to understand a thing is to some extent entertain that thing in your mind. Um, that's not quite the same as being the sort of like formal foundation for that thing, but merely the sort of, I guess, to use the Plato's analogy that we're going to get to at some point with the Theaetetus, the impression that's left on the wax, because you observe that thing, and then it's in your mind while you're observing it, but that's not the same as the form of the thing. So, right, I might observe a horse and then have the impression of the horse in my intellect, but that doesn't mean that I am the under in my intellect is where the form of the horse resides. So what I'm saying narrowly is just that the form of these things can't exist in God's mind, not necessarily that there can't be like the snapshot imprint of God observing these things. Because we know that he remembers these offenses when he then passes judgment on nations. So if he's remembering it, there has to be some act of the will, some place that it's remembered. But their sort of source of origin, I would argue, is a kind of moderate conceptualism from the intellect of, say, fallen angels or humans. And as to your second point, I think we talked about this before, and I used the example of like God maintaining a server. Like we're living in this computer server, and God booted it up and is maintaining it. But then what's kind of going on is going on with agents that have independent wills. Again, I'm not saying it's the divine watchmaker where he just has a hands-off approach, but then to what extent is his maintaining of the server of what we might call the universe then him being responsible for the acts themselves? Now, I think what I want to say here, though, is that, and this is sort of where I differ from what we might call classical theism or Thomism. I don't believe that evil or sin is nothingness, right? So goodness is existence. Satan is goodness insofar as he exists, and that nothingness is pure evil. I mean, firstly, Christ says that it would be better for the son of perdition never been born. It seems odd for him to say that it would be better to have the worst evil inflicted upon him. But then, second of all, I think that it's the act of the will that is evil. So it's not the bat that's evil. It's not your body that's evil. It's the act of the will to use both in conjunction to assault someone that's evil. And so the sort of underlying motive aspects would be the intellect of either humans or fallen angels.
Yeah, let's talk about the server example first, because I think this is a very very clarifying one. Um, so let's like examine the server in insofar as we experience it. So somebody else puts some technology together, and the technology puts these little building blocks on our computers. We can see it, and we can kind of interact with them. So the server is providing like this groundwork, and then our computers generate it for us, and then we interact with our computers to interact with the groundwork. So where it's analogous is in the sense of God building the world. Now, where I think it's interestingly disanalogous is the sense that we bring our wills into the server. So if somebody creates an MMO server and a player logs in, they're bringing something from outside of the world into the world with their interacting with it. So like our will itself isn't part of the MMO server. But because God creates purely ex nihilo, whatever dualistic immaterial thing, the soul or the will or whatever we are, it's not fundamental to reality because it's not a building block of existence. God creates it ex nihilo too. And so imagine the MMO case that the creator of the MMO not only creates the world in the server, but he creates the will of the players to a degree. Suppose the MMO is played by AI or something, and the MMO creator creates all the actions or dispositions and whatever of the AI into the server and kind of watches it go. So there's nothing that a user brings outside the server in, like we bring the will in. Everything is self-contained inside of the server. That I think is where the question gets interesting.
Right, that's where it's disanalogous, because we are, we're already in it. We're not bringing anything into it. And then I think so. What you're saying then is, the motive, or efficient cause of the thing. Because the way that I view the Christian conception of creation ex nihilo is that, well, on the one hand, all of reality is sustained in some way by God's existence. It does create something that is, of course, independent of him, right? Part of this whole theological conception is to avoid the idea of panentheism, where this is a part of God. And so it does start to have this operating on its own within constraints that are in part imposed by God, in the sense of the order that he creates. And so I guess the real question is it sufficiently disanalogous to not be a useful comparison? And I mean, that's sort of the problem with any analogy to God in the first place, because any appeal to any fact of the matter about human relationships to things is such that they're all equally disanalogous vis-a-vis God. It's just, the question is which one of us finds it more compelling or not.
Definitely, definitely. And where I get interested in this isn't necessarily an attack on Christianity or creation ex nihilo or whatever. One thing you said in that is where I've been meditating on this, and that's the degree of separation. So we don't want the universe to be God or made out of God. You want to have a degree of separation, which is what ex nihilo intends to do. My critique is, does it go far enough in giving a layer of separation? And to my mind, the answer might be no. I think we might be able to do a little better, and we might have to do a little better. Um, so, for example, if we want to make this like analogous in the best way to the MMO server, what if there was some will that was brought into the universe, kind of like outside of God sustaining it? And so, if we are kind of like hard dualists or something, maybe whatever the will makes up souls, the intellect, and so on, maybe that always exists, and it's part of God's canvas. And God's ex nihilo thing might just be with respect to, like, say, matter and physical stuff. So God creates physical stuff and whatnot, but then our mental activity kind of like boots in, like somebody logging into an MMO server, and then we can kind of like interact that way in the world that God has kind of made for us. That would allow the degree of separation, because now there's a degree of separation between what the human wills and what God creates. Um, where things get dicey, and only get dicey, is if there's no ontological like stuff or foundation to our will and what we want and what we think, apart from what God wills us to be ex nihilo. That's where the separation is kind of like broken. It seems like there's this direct connection to whatever I'm thinking and what God is willing me ex nihilo to think, because whatever my thoughts are constitutive of aren't kind of like the bottom. They aren't the fact of the matter. It's whatever God, does to make them that seems to be the bottom.
So I think there's a couple things here. One is, it sounds like what you're concerned about is that at least the forms of creation ex nihilo that you've been familiar with seems to, and correct me if I'm wrong, in your mind, to be more of a projection of God's will. So it's not really separating it from God's essence as much as some of its proponents might think, because the way they describe it, it seems to be more just a projection of the will. We sort of see that with I forget his name now. That one Christian inspiring philosophy, where he basically just says everything is a simulation of the mind of God. I don't know if you're going quite in that direction, but then the other thing to point out is we need to make a distinction between separate. So we want to avoid the idea that the universe is an emanation of God, sort of like Gnosticism and Platonism. And it's depend. But what about the distinction that it's distinct and dependent? So it's distinct from God in the sense that it's, the physical universe over here, but it's not distinct in the sense that there's pre-existing matter, like say the classical Greeks believed, but it's a distinct independent. What do you think about those things?
Um, yeah, I think what you're kind of circling around here is the other point in tension here, which is aseity. Things that have the universe being God, being part of God, being God himself, or even idealism, where the universe is just whatever God wills it to be so, it kind of maximizes God's aseity in the sense that there's dependence of everything on God and what God does, but not the other way around. You never want to get into a theological rabbit hole where it turns out that the universe is kind of like the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, as far as God goes. And I think that's what I'm getting out of what you said about your worry. And I think that's an interesting tension. I think one of the most interesting things to think about all of this is kind of balancing between God's aseity versus what kinds of things you want God to be responsible for. Because if God's aseity is too high, the buck stops with God in a lot of really uncomfortable situations. So, for example, if everything is God, then a murder that happens is literally identical to God. But what does it mean to say that God is all good in that instance? And so that's maybe too much aseity, right? Saying everything is God is making God maximally responsible for everything that happens. But on the other hand, it seems like we want to lessen the aseity of God and make everything fundamentally dependent on him because we want to have a view of free will that makes individuals, humans, ultimately responsible for their actions. And so we want to carve out a sphere of responsibility for creatures, but it seems like we can't carve out that sphere without making God less responsible. It seems like a zero-sum game, right? Either God's responsible for everything, and so nobody's ultimately responsible for anything, or everybody's responsible for everything, but then where do you fit God into the bottle? And what we seem to want is kind of like a Goldilocks thing where people have their own interlocking spheres of responsibility where things are going to have to give a little bit. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. So the analogy that I'm sort of developing in my mind is sort of like this, using like a political science analogy. On the one hand, we could have like a complete command economy police state, which would be the complete aseity of God, where everything is micromanaged by, the Politburo or something, or we have complete anarchy, where everything goes. There's no overarching order to it. But as a sort of political analog to this, we want to have both structured existence within a framework as well as meaningful choices, something like a representative form of government, which would be between the two. Do you think that's an analogous allegory?
Yeah, for a purely physical allegory, I think that's about right.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Now, as far as the satiety goes, okay, there's this is the elephant in the room, right? Because we talk about there's basically two within the Christian tradition. There's essentially two frameworks for viewing the ontology of God: the Eastern and the Western. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't some Protestants that hold to the Eastern view. There are, but it's broadly the Catholic view of divine simplicity, where we have the idea. I had a professor in college who, when we were talking about the members of the Trinity, said that there were just three names for the same thing. The sword, blade, and brand are three different names for the same thing. And he was saying that that's sort of what like the Trinity is. I remember in class saying, "Wait, isn't that just modalism?" Um, because three different names for the same thing aren't any way analogous or equivalent in any meaningful sense to three different persons. And there's that classic diagram of the Trinity, which is derived from the logical trivium. Where it has three little circles: Father, Son, and Spirit, all with a line going to the center is God, and then between them is a line saying is not, is not, is not. Now, that's the Western conception, and I think a lot of the questions you've been asking are developed from discussions about the nature of God within this framework of the ontology of the Trinity. And then there's the Eastern Orthodox view, which is the idea that only God the Father has full aseity, in the sense that he is the only person of the Godhead who has independent existence. So while the Son and the Spirit are still eternal, because they eternally proceed from the Father, they are not independent of the Father in the way that the Father is independent of everything else. And so even within Godhead itself, the Eastern conception of the Trinity would hold that the Son and the Spirit are dependent. Still God, still eternal, but they're dependent on the. So God the Father is logically, not temporally prior, logically and causally prior, but not temporally prior to the Son and the Spirit. I'm more convinced of the validity of the Eastern view on this point, but to what extent does highlighting that distinction on the ontology of God change this at all for you?
I think it's a really good analogy to investigate further. So let's go with that. So here I think is a really good pointed way of getting at my concern. Um, we want to say that in some sense Christ is dependent on God, the Son rather, but we don't necessarily want to say that the Son is just constitutive of whatever God makes the Son do. Because if the Son is just constitutive of whatever God makes the Son do, like some kind of a puppet, then it seems kind of like superfluous to talk about the Son as a distinct entity. Instead of saying like the Son, the Logos, Christ, whatever you want to say, wants X for humanity, realistically, ontologically, what we're saying is God wants X for humanity, and maybe the Son is some kind of like intermediary, but he's not doing the real bulk of the causal work there. God is, and maybe the Son is like the glass that God drinks milk from or something, analogically speaking, but he's not like his own thing. And so you want the dependence there, but you also want the entity to be its own thing. You want the Son to be, in some sense, distinct in personhood from the Father, so that the Son kind of brings something to the table that the Father himself does not bring to the table, to make them like worth talking about as separate persons. And that needle that's trying to be threaded in the Trinity is the exact same needle that's trying to be threaded when asking questions of, say, God and our own will. And I think that's one of the most useful things about the Christian Trinity is that a lot of the mystery of the Trinity maps onto the mystery of God's relationship to creation, especially as far as like the will, conscience, and so on is concerned.
Right. Well, again, I guess what I would want to say then is say for the Son and for the Spirit is not that their personhood is in any sense arbitrary, in the sense that God just the Father just chooses to will it this way or that way, but in the sense because they both are God and they are eternally proceed from the Father. The question then is, I think, so God the Father is just that kind of being that necessarily produces two other persons, and he's just such that kind of being that such with those two persons are created, they are such and such a way, not so much as an act of God just choosing it by like throwing a dart at the wall, but the very nature in which they are proceeding is what is constraining and creating their personhood.
Right. Yeah. I mean that part makes some sense to me. I guess the question isn't necessarily um what they're like, say, morally. The question is kind of like what they're like ontologically. So if, let's say, the Son comes and talks to humanity, not as like the incarnation, like the physical Jesus, but let's say as, I don't know, the incorporeal Jesus, the resurrected one, or um I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but like if Christ rules after the tribulation or whatnot, right, the new kingdom, does Christ rule immaterially or does he rule materially with that one?
Well, the millennium, it is going to be material. He does have a physical body.
He does have a physical. Okay, interesting. So I guess I'm trying to make this metaphor make sense. Um, so I guess we'll just say suppose it's prior to, because I remember a discussion hearing you talk with somebody else about this where prior to the incarnation, the Son was an immaterial part of the Godhead. And some people have speculated, I don't know if this is right or not because I'm terrible at this. I might be committing a heresy. Some people have speculated that some instances in which like angels talk to people in the Old Testament that don't have names or whatever else, like the angel of the
Abraham.
Lord in all caps, that might have been the Son talking to people directly. And so ontologically, the question is something like this: if the Son, as an immaterial aspect of the Godhead, talks to people, does the Son talk to people because God moves the mouth of the Son like a puppet, saying God is going to will the Son causally to ontologically move its bit such that the Son talks to people? Or is there a degree of separation between the Son's talking to somebody eminently on God's behalf, but is not being causally directed by God in his speech? That's the point we're putting on things here.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the parent-child analogy, which is also why we within the formula we use the word procession, and what we call God Father and then God the Son. The Son, he's he's distinct in an analogous way from the Father, in the same way, or in an analogous way that the Son is independent of his physical father. Now, of course, the physical father doesn't maintain his own child's existence day to day by eternally proceeding from him. Yes, that's where the analogy breaks down. But the kind of procession that's being discussed here is not one that would preclude Christ from acting in that way as an agent with an independent will of the Father, but such that what he wills out of love is the same as what the Father would will in his stead.
Yeah, they have the genetic nature and whatnot. So we have the genetic thesis that parents in some sense inherit something from their parents. We can radically extend that analogy to say that Christ is his own person or the Son is his own person. Um, but he does get a lot from his dad, like a lot from his dad, so to speak. And so yeah, this I think this really fine line we're trying to walk here is essentially the really fine line I see that we're trying to walk with the will. There is a sense in which we want God to be constitutive of something, kind of like make something be or be what it is, but the thing wants to have some independence. And so it seems to me like to have an account that really does that, it's almost like you want God to maintain the ontological structure of a thing, but there's some little sliver of something independent of God and his own actions that also gets to be inserted into the thing that gives that degree of separation. You see what I'm getting at here? Like God's maintaining the being of a thing, but what we want is just a sliver of something else where let me put it this way. Here's the best way I can put it. Um I think that the Son should be able to do something that God would not expect or direct him to do. However, whatever he does would not be inconsistent with something that God would hypothetically want him to do. You see what I'm saying? And so the question there is that the unexpected or undirected part. It's that little sliver we're trying to get.
Well, I don't think we need to insert that into the Trinity proper. And given that God the Father has omniscience, he would know what Christ would do in any given situation. Now, we might say, well, do we want to insert that into the created order with humans and angels? Yeah, we would, because otherwise, then they're a part of God now, and that just gets us back to the problem that we started with. Um, Now, what I would say is, what is that sliver of separation is the fact that there are independent wills. Now, I haven't demonstrated this, and I don't know anybody who has, but we could suppose that it's logically impossible to coerce a will. So once you create a will, there is a kind of indeterminacy at that point as to what that will is then going to do.
Right. Yeah. So this is where I might modify the creation ex nihilo doctrine just ever so slightly. Um, I would say something like God creates the material world out of nothing, but also will. There's an ontology of will, such that there is some will that gets to be like I guess causally independent in some degree. Um, that kind of gets spliced into it, right? So there's two ingredients. There's like the physical stuff that God can make out of nothing, but there's this fundamental ingredient called the will that can then be inserted such that like once a will has taken off, it becomes its own like where the buck stops, right? Your will is where the buck stops with you. You don't get to say, well, your will is ontologically constructed from you know God's will, aseity, ex nihilo creation, so on, you do get a ground floor there. I have this will, and here's where the buck stops. I think that's what we're trying to do.
I think so too. And now, how we want to demonstrate that, I don't know. But I feel like that those Christians that affirm free will would want to attempt to demonstrate something like that. And yeah, that's a big complicated problem to deal with. Was there any other avenues you wanted to follow? Because I know we had quite a few.
I mean, the big three were just the introduction of the problem, the discussion of creation ex nihilo, and then we were talking about the will, and we were also talking about like the ontology composing an act. So the will is one, and I think we've kind of got that mystery settled. So creation ex nihilo is kind of an oversimplification. It seems like we need one other ingredient that, in some sense, God can provide to the universe, but once He mixes it in, it's kind of like out of His hands, and that's the will to some degree. Um, but the other question, of course, is the ontology of an act itself. So C.S. Lewis's example of you're hitting your neighbor with a bat. Um, so in the sense that God is maintaining the physical reality of that happening moment to moment, never mind the will, never mind the problem of evil, like why does God allow it? Just the question of like God is like the etch a sketch drawing the event as it happens frame by frame by frame. That I think is the other kind of separate avenue of questions that I think are very interesting to think about.
Yeah, I guess the question is, do we have enough time to go into all those?
Right, absolutely. We could always pick this up another time, but that would be the third branch of the topic that we hadn't got to because that's what you asked is was there another thing, and technically yes. Now, as far as the
Right.
other two, um, I think we mostly got that covered. I guess we can spend the last little bit of time just kind of like brainstorming. Like, how do you think we might describe, like if we were to like put this into a principle or slightly like add something to ex nihilo, reformulate something for clarity, how do you think we might try that?
Right. Well, I think what ex nihilo tends to focus on is the physical nature of creation. And it really wants to avoid either a kind of emanationism where the material world emanates from God, and the further away you get from God, the more material you are. So it's like Platonism. And we also want to avoid like eternal matter, which is what I think Aristotle proposes. But if you don't include in that definition or some other parallel uh, creation narrative the will as well, then I think that's the problem you're getting at.
So it's kind of like a shot in the dark about this. So what do you think about something like this? It's if I was to describe the mode of creation to be creation material materia ex nihilo in one sense, and then I don't know what the Latin word for insert would be. But basically matter from nothing, soul into matter would be like the two principles. So soul is like this fundamental substance of which there is no further grounding, and that gets kind of like injected into grounding. You might even speculate that when, I don't know, this is going to be maybe heretic, but like when God breathes the breath of life into Adam in some sense, that is an injection of the soul essence that we're talking about into the things such that they now have a constituted will.
Right. Yeah. I don't necessarily think that's heretical. I think I've seen other Christians write like that. But yeah, it seems like what we've been focusing in on is that your concern is that it's too limited of a scope, and that because it's always about material things, material this, material that, it doesn't really get at the idea of, well, what about the soul? Now, when it comes to the free will debate, the soul always comes up, but it seems to not come up in the creation debate.
Exactly. And it's really, really important because a lot of the free will debate kind of takes a lot of stuff for granted. And it's just like, given that there's a me that exists in a world full of other yous, so to speak, could I have interacted with you differently? And it's all about kind of like decisions and counterfactuals. But me talking about philosophy of the mind and stuff like that, my primary interest about free will isn't about like guilt or being able to do otherwise. It's about ontology and what makes a person a person. which is why when we were debating with a mutual friend about this, I have the interesting position that's a bit different from both of yours, because what makes me me is a really interesting question. And so if it turns out that what makes me me isn't like some substance that's like a ground zero out of which I can kind of paint my canvas, or time and experience and a little something of my own can paint a canvas. But if it turns out there is no bottom, and like what makes me me is what God makes me, to use a very crude thing, right? I am what God makes me. Like really think about that in its full entirety. Questions about could I have done otherwise or whatever kind of become irrelevant at that point, because whatever I am, whatever I do is just what God has willed me or made me to do constitutively, ontologically. Not that like God puts a gun to my head or moves me like a puppet. It's even more than that. It's the very molecules of my thought God ordains in such a way that I'm just the thing that's going to do this. And so if you don't get a handle on the ontological question, everything else downstream from that gets very, very, very muddled. And so that's where I put my focus.
All right. Well, I guess I think we're out of time now. Would you want to consider that your final statement?
Sure, why not?
All right. Well, thanks again, Logos. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast.